After the collapse of former Soviet Union, USSR, many new states emerged. Ukraine is one of them, and it has played an important role in the global security order. Today, the country is on the front lines of a renewed great power rivalry that many analysts say will dominate international relations in the decades ahead. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 marked a dramatic escalation of the 8-year-old conflict that began with Russia's annexation of Crimea and signified a historic turning point for European security. Ukraine was a cornerstone of the Soviet Union, the arch-rival of the United States during the Cold War. Behind only Russia, it was the second most populous and powerful of the 15 Soviet republics, home to much of the Union's agricultural production, defense industries, and military, including the Black Sea Fleet and some of the nuclear arsenal. Ukraine was always vital to the Union. In its 3 decades of independence, Ukraine has sought to forge its own path as a sovereign state, while looking to align more closely with Western institutions, including the EU and NATO. A more nationalist, Ukrainian-speaking population in western parts of the country generally supported greater integration with Europe, while a mostly Russian-speaking community in the east favored closer ties with Russia. Ukraine became a battleground in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and began arming and abetting separatists in the Donbas region in the country's southeast. More than 14,000 people died in the fighting in the Donbas between 2014 and 2021. The hostilities marked a clear shift in the global security environment from a unipolar period of U.S. dominance to one defined by renewed competition between great powers. Russia has deep cultural, economic, and political bonds with Ukraine, and in many ways Ukraine is central to Russia's identity and vision for itself in the world. In February 2022, Russia embarked on a full-scale invasion of Ukraine with the aim of toppling the Western-aligned government of Volodymyr Zelensky and cast the escalating war with Ukraine as a part of a broader struggle against Western powers who, according to Russian President Putin, have intent on destroying Russia. Some analysts see Russia's 2022 invasion as the culmination of the Kremlin's growing resentment toward NATO's post-Cold War expansion into the former Soviet sphere of influence. Russian leaders, including Putin, have alleged that the United States and NATO repeatedly violated pledges they made in the early 1990s to not expand the alliance into the former Soviet bloc. They view NATO's enlargement during this tumultuous period for Russia as a humiliating imposition about which they could do little but watch. It was always Putin's goal to restore Russia to the status of a great power in northern Eurasia. The end goal was not to recreate the Soviet Union, but to make Russia great again. By seizing Crimea in 2014, Russia solidified its control of a strategic foothold on the Black Sea. With a larger and more sophisticated military presence there, Russia can project power deeper into the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa, where it has traditionally had limited influence. According to the Western interpretation of what led to the Russian invasion, Russia felt threatened by Ukraine because it was a liberalized nation that was outside of its sphere of influence and sought to cooperate with the West in trade, security, and politics, including the possibility of access to NATO and the EU. This put Russia's national security at risk and drove her to launch this military operation with the goal of installing a new, obedient Ukrainian government. On the other side, Russia's invasion is motivated by the fact that Western powers are exploiting Ukraine to further their influence, and that Russia has been using its troops to repress Russian-loyal civilians in separatist regions while committing genocide against its own people. The Russian government has also asserted that Ukraine's desire to join the NATO military alliance poses a serious risk to Russia's national security, since it would put NATO closer to its borders and allow it to expand to the east, endangering Russia's very existence. When Ukraine refused to engage in negotiations before the invasion, Russia says that these two concerns provided it the justification to use force against Ukraine. With the rise of China and its growing relation with Russia, restoring and strengthening Ukraine's sovereignty re-emerged as a top U.S. and EU foreign policy priority. Following the 2022 invasion, U.S. and NATO allies dramatically increased defense, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, as well as ramped up their sanctions on Russia. the United States remains committed to the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Prior to the 2022 invasion, the United States supported a settlement of the Donbas conflict via the Minsk agreements. Western powers and their partners have taken many steps to increase aid to Ukraine and punish Russia for its 2022 offensive. International sanctions on Russia have also been vastly expanded, covering much of its financial, energy, defense, and tech sectors, and targeting the assets of wealthy oligarchs and other individuals. The ban on some Russian banks from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication and by blacklisting Russia's central bank by U.S. and some European governments has disastrous impact on many of underdeveloped and developing countries. The global supply chain have been disrupted by an embargo on Russian exports and Russian retaliation against foreign imports. This have resulted in scarcity and a rise in the price of imported goods leading to higher prices. This effect may exacerbate it if Russia imposes a retaliatory export embargo on energy supplies to Europe and the rest of the world. Fiscal deficits, high debt to GDP ratios, and high inflation rates raise the possibility of hyperinflation. Oil, gas, and food costs continue to rise as a result of conflicts. European oil marketers and oil corporations are facing difficulties in receiving energy supplies from Russia, since Russia is the world's second-largest oil producer and sells most of its crude oil to European refineries. Russia is also the largest supplier of natural gas to Europe, providing about 2/5 of its supplies. Because of Russia's large share of oil export, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is likely to lead to energy supply shocks and a steady rise in energy prices. It has raised living expenses because the price of lighting, autos, and mortgage deductions may rise dramatically. Additionally, it affects emerging nations that rely on energy imports, resulting higher local fuel prices, higher food prices, and an overall rise in commodity imports. In emerging nations, this results in higher inflation and rising living expenses. Higher global inflation may result from both developed and emerging nations' combined effects. This have increased worldwide inflation in a number of nations. The consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine have already shaken not just the nations but also the region and the world, and point to the importance of a global safety net and regional arrangements in place to buffer economies. While some effects may not fully come into focus for many years, there are already clear signs that the war and resulting jump in costs for essential commodities will make it harder for policymakers in some countries to strike the delicate balance between containing inflation and supporting the economic recovery from the pandemic. Underdeveloped and developing countries are most impacted by the conflict. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict has demonstrated that imposing sanctions on a belligerent nation is not the best course of action, since it adversely affects other nations that are not parties to the dispute, particularly if those other nations are economic partners with the belligerent nation. Therefore, political leaders should work to prevent crises like the one between Ukraine and Russia, and should also employ dialogue as a method of settling disputes.